The studio lights beamed down brightly, and the atmosphere in the talk show set was electric. The audience was buzzing with excitement as they eagerly awaited the arrival of Karoline Leavitt, the political figure known for her sharp wit and fiery personality. Today, she was about to face off against one of the most outspoken liberal hosts in the media world, a man who was no stranger to controversial remarks and heated debates. It was clear that something big was about to happen. The liberal host, sitting comfortably behind his desk, had already made a name for himself as someone who wasn't afraid to challenge his guests, especially those who held opposing views. With his trademark smirk and a voice full of confidence, he had built an empire on being the sharpest voice in the room. The audience knew what to expect from him: hard-hitting questions, quick jabs, and unfiltered opinions. But what they didn't know was that today, something unexpected was about to unfold. As Karoline walked onto the stage, the room fell into an eager hush. She was poised, her eyes sharp, and there was a confidence in the way she carried herself that suggested she was more than ready for whatever the host would throw at her. The applause from the audience was loud and genuine as they welcomed her. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. It wasn't just a regular interview. This was about to become something far more intense. She sat down across from the host, her posture straight, her gaze steady. The host, already grinning, looked at her with that familiar cocky expression. He leaned forward slightly and began the usual small talk, setting the stage for what was expected to be a friendly yet somewhat tense conversation. But deep down, both Karoline and the host knew that this would not be a normal interview. Something was different. The tension was already building, and it was clear that neither one of them would hold back. The host, eager to stir the pot, began with a question he knew would set the stage for a clash. He asked about Karoline's political stance on a highly controversial issue that was dominating the headlines. His voice was casual, but there was a hint of challenge in it. He was testing her, trying to find an opening, a weakness, anything that could give him an advantage in this conversation. He wanted to see her squirm, to prove her views wrong in front of the entire audience. Karoline, however, remained calm and composed. Her response was sharp, but it was her eyes, focused and unflinching, that told the host she wasn't intimidated. She didn't give him the reaction he expected. Instead, she answered with precision, her words deliberate and full of conviction. The host raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised by her confidence, but he quickly recovered and fired back with another question, determined to catch her off guard. The host's challenge, however, was met with something he hadn't anticipated. Karoline didn't shy away from his jabs. She met them head-on, with a mix of humor and sharpness that caught him completely off guard. She didn't just defend her views, she made him question his own. Each time he tried to push her into a corner, she responded with a devastatingly clever remark that left him fumbling for words. The audience, once unsure of how this confrontation would play out, now watched in awe as Karoline calmly dismantled the host's arguments, one point at a time. Then came the moment that would change the entire dynamic of the interview. The host, a little frustrated and clearly trying to regain control, asked Karoline a question that he believed would be her downfall. He had a smirk on his face, ready to watch her stumble. It was a question designed to expose her, to make her look out of touch or misinformed. He thought he had her cornered. But Karoline, with her quick thinking, responded in a way that no one saw coming. She leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she delivered a roast that left the audience in stitches. "You know," she began, her tone light yet sharp, "if I had $1 for every time someone on this show tried to challenge me with the same tired questions, I'd probably be able to buy a better argument." The room erupted in laughter. The liberal host, for the first time, was caught completely off guard. His usual smug demeanor faltered, and his smirk quickly disappeared. For a split second, he seemed to forget his next question. The audience was on the edge of their seats, unsure if Karoline had just pulled off the greatest comeback, or if the host would immediately fire back with something equally clever. But what happened next left everyone in suspense. Karoline's response wasn't just funny. It was clever, well-timed, and delivered with such confidence that it turned the entire energy of the conversation upside down. The host, known for his quick comebacks, was stunned into silence. His mouth opened, then closed, as he tried to formulate a response. But the damage had been done. The control of the conversation had shifted completely in Karoline's favor. The audience, once holding their breath, now erupted into applause. Karoline had just flipped the script in a way no one expected. It wasn't just her words that stunned the host. It was her ability to take control of the situation and make him the one on the defensive. The host, visibly rattled, knew that he had just lost the upper hand. And as the laughter continued, it was clear that Karoline had made her mark. The tension in the air was palpable now. The host, trying to regain his composure, muttered something under his breath. But Karoline was already one step ahead. She wasn't just there to defend her views. She was there to own the conversation. And in that moment, she had done just that. As the segment continued, the once intense atmosphere had completely shifted. The host's cocky attitude had been replaced with an air of uncertainty, while Karoline remained confident, in control, and ready for whatever came next. What had started as an expected political debate had turned into a showdown that no one would forget anytime soon. The stage was set for a battle of words and wits, and Karoline Leavitt had just made the first move. As the audience continued to chuckle and applaud Karoline's sharp-witted roast, the liberal host sat there, stunned. His usual confidence, which had made him such a formidable presence on the show, was quickly slipping away. For the first time in his career, he was caught off guard, and it showed. His grin, once so smug and self-assured, faded into a stunned silence. He tried to recover, but his mind raced for the right words, and for a moment, there was nothing but awkward stillness. The camera zoomed in, capturing the host's flustered expression. He opened his mouth, as if to respond, but no words came out. The studio, which had once been filled with the sound of his rapid-fire questioning, now felt eerily quiet. Even the audience, still buzzing from the unexpected moment, could feel the shift in the energy of the room. The literal host was no longer in control. Karoline had completely turned the tables, and it was clear that she wasn't going to back down. For a few moments, he struggled to find his footing. His eyes darted from Karoline, who was sitting across from him with a small, knowing smile on her face, to the audience, which was still caught in the laughter that her sharp remark had ignited. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost the upper hand. His carefully constructed narrative of control was unraveling before his eyes. Karoline, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed by the host's reaction. She sat back in her chair, relaxed and confident, as if this was exactly what she had expected to happen. She wasn't just handling the situation with grace, she was enjoying it. The audience could sense this, and their respect for her grew even more. They had come to see a debate, a clash of opinions, but what they were witnessing now was something much more thrilling, an intellectual and verbal sparring match, with Karoline clearly holding her ground. After what felt like an eternity, the host finally managed to speak. His voice wavered slightly, as he tried to mask his embarrassment. "Well, that's certainly one way to put it," he said, his tone attempting to recover but coming off as forced. His usual sharp wit had been temporarily silenced, and it was evident that he didn't know how to move forward after being so unexpectedly outclassed. Karoline, ever quick on her feet, took advantage of his hesitation. "It's the truth," she replied smoothly, her voice calm but with just enough edge to let him know she wasn't about to let up. "If you're going to come at me with the same tired talking points, you're going to need more than a few rehearsed questions. But I guess that's what happens when you get too comfortable in your own echo chamber, right?" The audience erupted again. Karoline had just expertly turned the host's discomfort into another jab. The host's face, which had been red from both the heat of the moment and the audience's reaction, grew even darker with the sting of her words. For a brief moment, He seemed to lose track of what he was saying, fumbling with his notes as if looking for something that would bring him back into the conversation. But Karoline had already taken over, her presence commanding the room. He glanced at the producer off stage, as if searching for some sign of support, but the camera stayed fixed on him, waiting for his next move. His smirk was gone, and there was no denying it now. He had been publicly bested. The host, known for his quick wit and sharp comebacks, was now a mere spectator in his own show. In an attempt to regain some control, the host shifted the topic back to politics, trying to veer the conversation back to something he could dominate. But Karoline, never missing a beat, responded with a quiet yet powerful statement that struck at the heart of his previous attempts to control the conversation. "You know, what you're asking isn't new," she said calmly. "It's the same question people always ask when they can't argue against the actual policies or ideas, so they go for the personal attacks instead." This time, the audience didn't just laugh. They nodded in agreement. Karoline had struck a chord. The host's attempt to steer the conversation into familiar territory had failed. The audience was no longer interested in his tired political questions. They were captivated by Karoline's ability to dismantle the host's entire argument, piece by piece, while maintaining her composure. The liberal host, now visibly rattled, tried to maintain a semblance of confidence. He cleared his throat and leaned forward again, as if trying to force the conversation into the direction he wanted. "I'm sure you think you've won this one, Karoline," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "But we both know you can't dodge these questions forever. The truth will come out." Karoline leaned in, her expression serious for a moment, and the studio seemed to quiet down in anticipation. She could have taken the bait. She could have played into his attempt to manipulate the conversation into yet another tired political debate. But instead, she smiled lightly and simply said, "The truth is, sometimes, the best way to win a fight is to stop playing by the other person's rules." The host's expression faltered for a second, and the audience was left in suspense. It was as though Karoline had just laid down a challenge that the host wasn't prepared for. The power in the room had shifted. Karoline had become the one to dictate the terms of the debate, not him. For the rest of the segment, the host was noticeably more subdued, trying to mask his frustration with increasingly forced questions. Karoline, however, remained unshaken. She had taken control of the conversation with her clever remarks and undeniable confidence. The tension that had once been thick in the air now seemed to favor her. She had successfully turned the tables on the liberal host, and the audience could feel the change in the room. As the segment wrapped up, the host tried to regain his composure with a final remark, but the damage had been done. Karoline had not only defended herself, she had owned the entire conversation. The audience knew it, the host knew it, and for the first time, it seemed like the liberal host had met his match. The studio, once filled with the liberal host's usual confident voice, now seemed to echo with a new energy, Karoline's energy. She had effortlessly shifted the dynamic of the conversation in a matter of moments, and the host, who was once the undisputed star of the show, now seemed like a secondary player in his own production. It wasn't just that Karoline had outwitted him with a few sharp comments. She had taken the very control of the interview from him, showing her intelligence, poise, and fearless attitude. As the host floundered for a way to reassert himself, Karoline remained composed and calm, letting her words do the work. She knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just another interview. This was a moment to show that someone with her views, her voice, could stand strong and unapologetic even in the face of aggressive opposition. Karoline's confidence was more than just an attitude. It was a demonstration of her ability to handle the pressure of a live, national audience and come out on top. She wasn't intimidated. She was ready. The host, trying to gather his thoughts, moved to a new angle. He leaned forward again, trying to regain control by going for what he thought was an unshakable question. It was a challenge that he hoped would put Karoline on the defensive. The words came out quickly, almost as if he were trying to rush his way back to dominance. "So, Karoline, you've managed to throw a few jabs, but we both know that avoiding real questions about policy won't help you in the long run. Let's talk facts." But Karoline didn't flinch. Her response came so fast and sharp that it was clear she had anticipated this move. "Facts," she said with a slight tilt of her head, her voice casual, "are funny things, aren't they? You know, the ones you always bring up as a way to steer the conversation, but somehow always forget to back up with real evidence. Let's talk about real solutions, not just talking points." The audience, who had been watching with bated breath, erupted into applause once again. Karoline had just expertly turned his question on its head. She hadn't avoided the topic, but instead, she had challenged the host's entire approach to the debate. It was a brilliant move, one that showed her mastery over the conversation. She wasn't just answering questions, she was reshaping the entire discussion. The liberal host's smirk, which had been his trademark throughout countless interviews, had all but disappeared, replaced by a look of frustration. He tried to regain his cool, but it was clear that Karoline was in full control now. The host, no longer sure of how to respond, shifted gears again, attempting to bring the conversation back to a more personal level. He made a pointed remark, almost as if to provoke Karoline into reacting emotionally, something that might give him a foothold again. "I guess it's easier to deflect when you can't defend your position. It must be nice to just throw out clever lines and avoid answering the real questions." But Karoline, never one to back down, leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she wasn't intimidated. "It's funny, you know," she began, her tone light, but her words carrying weight. "You keep trying to make this personal. You've been throwing around jabs like they're supposed to make me lose focus. But it doesn't seem to be working, does it?" The host's face reddened. He was no longer the one leading the charge. He was no longer the one in control of the narrative. Karoline, with her quick wit and unflappable demeanor, had not only held her ground but had managed to turn every question into an opportunity to showcase her intelligence and resilience. His repeated attempts to push her into a corner had failed time and time again. This wasn't just a war of words, it had become a battle of intellect. Karoline was proving that she wasn't just another political figure with rehearsed talking points. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who could think on her feet and handle the toughest challenges without ever losing her cool. And the audience was noticing. The once boisterous and unchallenged liberal host had now been reduced to scrambling for his footing. Karoline had managed to steal the spotlight without ever raising her voice, relying solely on her sharp mind and poised composure. The host, who had once been the master of his own domain, was now left in the uncomfortable position of trying to keep the conversation going. But every question felt forced, every comment seemed desperate. His typical method of dominating the conversation with his quick remarks was no longer working. Karoline had thrown him off his game completely, and the power balance had shifted. But Karoline wasn't done yet. She had sensed his desperation, and rather than letting him flounder, she decided to show just how completely she had taken control. With one final remark, she delivered the knockout blow. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "it's pretty clear now that when it comes to having an actual discussion, you're a little out of your depth. But don't worry, I'm sure the audience here will remember the times you tried, even if it didn't go quite as planned." The studio erupted in applause again, and this time, it was a moment of victory for Karoline. The liberal host, looking increasingly defeated, sat back in his chair. He couldn't even muster a reply, knowing that his chance to dominate the conversation had passed. His smirk had been replaced by a hint of embarrassment, and it was clear that Karoline had won, not just the debate, but the entire narrative. As the camera panned out and the audience continued to cheer, it was evident that Karoline had emerged victorious. The host's attempts to regain control had failed, and the audience was left in no doubt that Karoline had completely turned the tables on him. What had started as a typical political debate had turned into an unforgettable display of wit, intelligence, and confidence. With every word Karoline spoke, she had drawn the audience closer, pulling them into her world where facts mattered, but so did the power of a well-timed comeback. Karoline Leavitt had shown everyone watching that she wasn't just another political figure. She was a master of the moment. The camera panned across the studio, capturing the shifting expressions of the once confident liberal host. His face had gone from cocky to flustered in what felt like an instant. Every time he tried to regain his footing, Karoline Leavitt expertly pushed him back, making it clear that he wasn't going to regain control of the interview anytime soon. The usual confident host, the man known for his quick wit, his sharp bards, was now struggling to hold on, and the audience could see it. It was a rare sight, one that few would have expected to witness, but here it was, unfolding right in front of them. The host's attempts to salvage the conversation grew increasingly desperate. With each new question he tried to ask, he seemed to be speaking more out of habit than genuine curiosity. The usual sharpness in his voice had dulled, replaced by a subtle but undeniable hint of frustration. He was caught in a moment he couldn't control, and the harder he tried, the more apparent it became that Karoline Leavitt had already won. Karoline, however, was still calm. She was composed, her posture relaxed, and her expression confident. She knew exactly what she was doing. With every comment, every answer, she subtly reinforced her dominance in the conversation. She wasn't trying to be aggressive or combative. She didn't need to be. She was simply laying bare the flaws in the host's argument and questioning the very foundation of his approach. The host had underestimated her. Now, the tables had turned, and there was no way for him to recover from the momentum Karoline had built. In a final attempt to regain some of the authority he had lost, the host tried shifting tactics. He moved away from politics and attempted to play on Karoline's personal beliefs, a strategy he had used in the past to unnerve guests. He leaned forward slightly, trying to look more sincere, almost pleading. "You know, Karoline, we both know that there are some things in life that go beyond politics. Things that matter to all of us, things that don't fit neatly into a party line. Don't you think it's time to look at things from a more open perspective?" He was hoping that his attempt to sound empathetic would soften Karoline, perhaps make her hesitate or reconsider her sharp-edged arguments. But Karoline wasn't buying it. She saw right through his maneuver, recognizing it for what it was, another tactic to steer the conversation back to the host's territory. Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged. "I've always been open to different perspectives," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The issue is, when you're just repeating the same arguments over and over, dressed up in different clothes, it's not a real conversation. You've got to be willing to move beyond the scripted lines, and that's where we seem to be running into trouble, don't we?" Her words hit the mark, and the host visibly stiffened. It was another perfectly timed response that left him momentarily speechless. He couldn't deny it. He was trapped in the cycle of his own arguments, offering nothing new, nothing real. Karoline had called him out, and now there was no way back from it. The audience, who had been watching with rapt attention, could feel the power shift. The dynamic was so apparent that even the studio crew, in the background, couldn't help but notice the change in atmosphere. Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a guest on the show. She was the one calling the shots, and the host was left scrambling to catch up. The tension in the air grew even more intense. Every eye in the room was on the host, wondering how, if at all, he would respond. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that only happens when the inevitable has already occurred. Karoline, sensing her victory, didn't stop. She didn't need to. "You know, it's not about being open to all opinions," she continued, her voice steady. "It's about being willing to recognize when a conversation has stopped being productive. And right now, I think we're at that point." The host's cheeks flushed slightly. He could feel the weight of her words, and for a brief moment, he knew she was right. He had nothing left to offer. The audience could sense the discomfort that now settled in the studio. The host, so used to being the one in control, was now fumbling for a way to salvage some semblance of authority. He had failed, and it was too obvious to ignore. With his pride wounded, he took a deep breath and attempted to speak again, his voice betraying the cracks in his facade. "Well, I guess if you don't want to have an honest conversation." He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence, and his voice faltered. Karoline didn't let him finish. "What's the point of an honest conversation if you're not actually listening?" she asked, her words sharp but perfectly measured. It wasn't just the content of her reply. It was the way she had delivered it. The question itself was a challenge, a subtle reminder that the conversation had been one-sided from the start, and it was time for the host to take responsibility for that. The silence that followed felt longer than any of them had anticipated. The host, visibly deflated, sat back in his chair. The control he had once commanded was gone. Karoline had done what few could ever accomplish on such a stage. She had completely outplayed him at his own game. As the segment ended and the camera pulled back to show the full set, the host remained frozen in his chair, his hands resting awkwardly in his lap. Karoline, however, was poised, sitting back with a knowing smile that spoke volumes. She hadn't just won the conversation. She had completely dismantled the host's arguments and exposed his inability to carry the debate. The studio, once filled with the host's confident energy, now carried a palpable sense of uncertainty. Karoline had taken control, and no one in the room was going to forget it. As the final moments of the interview approached, the tension in the room was palpable. The host, now visibly deflated, attempted one last desperate jab in an effort to salvage some sense of control. "Well, Karoline, you might have won this round," he said, his voice forced and lacking conviction, "but let's see how long you can keep this up." Karoline, unfazed by his attempt to save face, delivered a devastating response, her tone calm yet packed with undeniable confidence. "Winning is not about making noise," she said with a slight smile. "It's about standing firm, even when your opponent tries everything to break you. And as for the future, let's just say I'm not going anywhere." The host, unable to hide the sting of defeat, simply nodded, his mouth unable to form any more rebuttals. The camera zoomed in, capturing the defeat on his face, his earlier smugness gone, replaced by an expression of realization. He had lost. The audience, sensing the shift, watched in awe as Karoline's calm dominance left the host with nothing more to say. With one final, collected glance at the host, Karoline stood up, exuding the confidence of someone who had already won the battle. The crowd erupted into applause, the room vibrating with the energy of her undeniable triumph. As the segment ended, Karoline had not only proved her point, she had cemented her place as an unstoppable force in the debate. The host, once the star of the show, had been reduced to nothing more than an afterthought. And just like that, the stage was hers. As the show wrapped up, the buzz in the studio was electric. Karoline Leavitt had done what few people could. She had completely turned the tables on a seasoned liberal talk show host, leaving him floundering in her wake. The show's producers were quickly hustling behind the scenes, scrambling to make sense of the unexpected turn of events. The host, once the star of the segment, was now struggling to save face, his usual charisma replaced by a rare moment of silence. But the true impact of Karoline's triumph was about to unfold. This wasn't just about what had happened in the studio. This was about how the nation would react. As soon as the segment aired, social media erupted with reaction videos, tweets, and comments. The video clip of Karoline's final, unflinching remark to the host spread like wildfire. Headlines flooded the internet. Karoline Leavitt destroys liberal host on live TV. Liberal host left speechless by Karoline Leavitt's sharp wit, and Karoline Leavitt turns the tables. Host can't keep up. People from all corners of the political spectrum were talking about it. Even those who might not typically agree with her views couldn't help but admire the way she had dismantled her opponent. One viral tweet read, Never seen someone take control of a conversation like that. Karoline Leavitt is built different. The tweet had thousands of retweets, showing just how widespread the response was. On the other side, the liberal host's supporters, unable to hide their disappointment, began to come to his defense. This isn't fair. He didn't get a chance to speak, they argued. But the truth was undeniable. Karoline had taken control of the conversation and had expertly outmaneuvered him at every turn. No matter how much they tried to spin it, the clip told its own story. Even political analysts and pundits who had been watching were forced to admit Karoline had played the game better. She didn't just counter every point the host made. She dismantled his arguments in real time, drawing attention to the flaws in his questioning and exposing the weakness in his rhetoric. A few hours later, a phone call was made to Karoline's team. It was from a rival news network that had seen the clip and wanted to have her on for an exclusive interview. They didn't just want to talk politics. They wanted to understand the woman who had pulled off such a stunning victory. The demand for her voice and her perspective had never been higher. For Karoline, it wasn't just a victory in a single debate. It was a statement. She had shown the world that she wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in, even in the face of an overwhelming opponent. But more importantly, she had proven that sharp wit, intelligence, and composure could change the course of a conversation and leave a lasting impact. Back in the studio, the host had finished his segment, his pride bruised. He had heard the buzz on social media, the commentary that was now flooding in. His once dominant position had crumbled, and he knew it. There was no way to undo what had just happened. What had started as a routine interview had turned into an unforgettable moment of public humiliation for him. For Karoline, however, it was just another win in a much bigger game. As she made her way out of the studio, Karoline Leavitt couldn't help but smile to herself. She had entered that interview knowing that it would be challenging, but she never imagined it would end with such a clear-cut victory. The battle was over, and for her, it had been a flawless victory. The world would now be watching her closely, and she knew it. But more than that, she understood the weight of her victory, how much it would resonate with those who had been looking for someone to challenge the status quo, someone to stand up and speak with conviction, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against them. In the end, Karoline had not only won the debate, she had captured the spotlight. And it was clear that her influence was only just beginning. As the days passed, the echoes of Karoline Leavitt's victory continued to reverberate across the media landscape. The show she had dominated had become the talk of the nation, and Karoline's quick-witted, unflinching performance had solidified her as a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just that she had outsmarted a liberal host in a public debate. She had shown that anyone, even in the most challenging situations, could hold their ground and rise above the noise. In the weeks following the interview, Karoline's profile continued to grow. She appeared on multiple news outlets, podcasts, and even had a few surprise guest spots on political panels. What stood out most wasn't just her increasing visibility. It was the growing respect she was earning from people across the political spectrum. Regardless of their political affiliations, many had come to admire her for one simple reason. She wasn't afraid to speak her truth, even when the odds were against her. Her impact wasn't just confined to the political world. Social media platforms were flooded with people who had been inspired by her bravery. A new wave of political figures, particularly younger people, started to rally around Karoline. They admired her poise, her ability to stay calm under pressure, and most of all, her ability to take on a difficult opponent and come out victorious. It wasn't just a political victory, it was a cultural moment. She had shown the world that confidence and intelligence could win the day, even in the most intense situations. More than anything, Karoline had proven something much bigger. She had shattered the illusion that only those with years of experience or those in positions of established power could dominate the public conversation. By staying true to herself and her beliefs, she had carved out a place for herself in the political discourse. She didn't need the permission of any media outlet or political party to make her mark. She had done it on her own terms. Even her critics, who initially dismissed her as a lightweight or a passing figure, were forced to acknowledge her. Their rhetoric shifted from outright dismissal to an attempt to understand just what made her so effective. Some were now trying to figure out how she had managed to turn the tide so completely in her favor. What they didn't understand was simple. Karoline wasn't trying to play the game the way it had always been played. She had changed the rules. Her appearance on the talk show had started as a political discussion, but it quickly became a public spectacle. Karoline had controlled the conversation, and in doing so, she had changed the way people viewed political debates. It was no longer just about who had the loudest voice or the sharpest insult. It was about who could deliver a message with substance, wit, and conviction. Karoline's victory was a call to action for anyone who had ever felt silenced or overshadowed in a debate. They too could stand strong. As for the host, his career had taken a hit. The media world, which once praised his quick wit and relentless questioning, began to question whether his approach had become outdated. The backlash was swift, and for the first time in years, his usual spot in the spotlight was uncertain. While he still had his loyal followers, it was clear that his time of dominance was fading. People no longer viewed him as the top dog in the world of political talk shows. But Karoline wasn't focused on his decline. She was focused on the future. With every interview, with every appearance, she was establishing herself as a key figure in the national conversation. She wasn't just a one-hit wonder. Her victory had set the stage for something bigger. And so, Karoline Leavitt continued to rise. Her popularity grew not because of any political machine behind her, but because of her ability to connect with people on a human level. She wasn't speaking to them through the lens of partisan politics. She was speaking to them with honesty, confidence, and above all, authenticity. Her message was clear. You don't have to play by the old rules to make a difference. You just need to be yourself. The legacy of that interview, the moment where she had so effortlessly outsmarted a veteran host, was more than just a story of a successful debate. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Karoline Leavitt, one where she would continue to defy expectations and challenge the status quo. Her rise wasn't just a moment of political victory. It was a movement. And the nation, whether they liked it or not, was watching.